silence in the Miller house had always been heavy, but after the accident, it became a living thing, pressing down on every surface, muffling every sound. Sarah, barely 7, was the only one who seemed impervious to its suffocating weight. Her twin sister, Lily, had been gone for 6 months, a small, vibrant life extinguished in a tragic, inexplicable house fire. Yet, Sarah insisted Lily was still there. Not in memory, not in spirit, but physically present, living inside the walls of their master bedroom. Her parents, Elias and Clara, attributed it to childhood grief, a coping mechanism for an unimaginable trauma. They'd smile weakly, pat her head, and tell her Lily was in heaven. But Sarah would just shake her head, her eyes an unnerving shade of ice blue that mirrored Lily's, fixed on the wallpaper. "She's just tiny now, Dad," she'd whisper, her voice a reedy sensation that made the hairs on Elias's arm stand on end. "She says the big people are too loud." The insistence began to chip away at Elias's composure. Sarah would sit for hours, her ear pressed against the wall of the master bedroom, giggling softly as if sharing a secret joke. Sometimes she'd ask for specific things for Lily: a thimble-sized teacup, a crumb of Elias's toast, a strand of Clara's hair. Elias would dismiss it, but he noticed Clara, pale and withdrawn, sometimes leaving a small, polished button or a miniature doll shoe on the floor near the wall, her movements furtive, almost ashamed. The shadows of their grief were beginning to manifest in strange ways. One evening, Elias was trying to work in his study, but the rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch from the master bedroom became unbearable. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like a tiny hand drawing on plaster. He confronted Sarah, his voice sharper than he intended. "Sarah, there's no one in there. It's just an old house." Sarah looked at him, her blue eyes wide and unblinking. "But Daddy," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "Lily says you're wrong. She says she's almost finished with the new wallpaper for her room." The phrase, "her room," sent a cold shiver down Elias's spine. The house, a sprawling Victorian, had always felt less like a shelter and more like a mausoleum since Lily's death. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the ancient plumbing, now sounded like a whisper from within the walls. He started to notice subtle shifts in the master bedroom itself. A faint, sweet, cloying smell, like drying paint and honey, would sometimes emanate from a specific section of the wall near the headboard. It was almost imperceptible, a sensation that would disappear if he tried to pinpoint it. The metamorphosis of their perception was gradual but insidious. Elias found himself pressing his own ear against the wall one night, drawn by an irresistible, almost hypnotic curiosity. He heard nothing at first, just the distant hum of the city. Then, from deep within the plaster and lath, came a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as his imagination. It was a tiny, delicate humming, like a child singing a lullaby, muffled and distorted, but undeniably there. It sounded like Lily. Panic, cold and realistic, began to bloom in Elias's chest. This wasn't grief. This wasn't imagination. This was analog horror manifesting in his own home. He looked at the wallpaper, a floral pattern of roses and vines. He noticed a faint seam, a subtle misalignment of the pattern, directly over the spot where he heard the humming. It looked like a section of the wall had been cut out, meticulously replaced, and then repapered with expert precision. The exposed truth began to dawn on him. This wasn't about Sarah's imaginary friend. This was about something else, something terrifyingly concrete. He remembered the fire. The investigators had found no cause, no accelerant, no faulty wiring. The fire had started in Lily's bedroom, but the damage was contained, almost surgically precise. Lily's bed, her toys, her clothes all gone. But the rest of the house, miraculously, was largely untouched. It was almost as if the fire had been selective. The next morning, driven by revenge against the insidious dread that was consuming his family, Elias bought a stud finder and a small inspection camera. He told Clara he was looking for a leak, a convenient lie that barely masked the shadows in his eyes. He scanned the master bedroom wall, his heart pounding a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. The stud finder beeped erratically, indicating a cavity behind the wall where a solid stud should have been. He drilled a tiny hole. The drill bit went through drywall, then a thin layer of plaster, then nothing. The camera, small and snake-like, snaked its way into the darkness. Elias's hand trembled as he watched the monitor. The image was grainy, flickering with static, but undeniably clear-eyed. It wasn't just a cavity. It was a room. A miniature room, perfectly proportioned, fully furnished. He saw a tiny four-poster bed with a doll-sized quilt, a miniature dresser with impossibly small drawers. On the wall, hand-drawn wallpaper, a pattern of smiling red-haired girls. Then the camera spun. Slowly, in the center of the miniature room, sitting on the tiny bed, was a doll. It was Lily's favorite doll, a porcelain figure with bright, ice-blue eyes. As the camera's weak light hit it, the doll's head tilted. The eyes, so eerily familiar, blinked, and a small, pale hand reached out from beneath the tiny quilt, beckoning to him. Elias gasped. Dropping the drill. From the wall, a faint, sweet smell, like burning sugar and tiny human tears, began to emanate. He looked at the wallpaper, and the smiling red-haired girls began to weep, their painted tears tracing crimson paths down the miniature walls. Camera fell from Elias's slick palms, the screen cracking against the floorboards. But the image remained seared into his retinas. The blinking porcelain eyes, the twitch of the hand. It wasn't the fluid motion of a living thing, but a jerky stop-motion sensation. Twitch that suggested a body forced to operate on a scale it wasn't designed for. He scrambled backward, his breath coming in ragged, claustrophobic gasps. The master bedroom, once his sanctuary, now felt like a giant's cage, and the walls were no longer boundaries, but a metamorphosis of wood and plaster hiding a parasitic reality. Clara appeared in the doorway, her silhouette a jagged shadow against the hall light. She didn't ask what he was doing. She didn't scream at the hole in the wall. She merely stared at the discarded drill with a hollow, realistic acceptance that was more terrifying than any outburst. Her skin looked paper-thin, exposed to a light that shouldn't exist. She walked over to the hole, the smell of burnt sugar and old medicine thickening around her. She knelt, her knees clicking in the silence, and whispered into the cavity, "Is it finished, Lily? Is the parlor ready?" Elias felt a surge of viral horror nausea. His wife wasn't grieving. She was participating. The miniature house wasn't a discovery to her. It was a construction project. He realized then that the trauma of the fire had been the foundation, and the weeks of silence had been the labor. Every time Clara had been withdrawn, she had been feeding the wall. Every time Sarah had asked for a crumb, she was supplying the larder of a miniature kingdom. The shadows in the house weren't just absence of light. They were the architects, driven by a desperate revenge against the madness. Elias grabbed a heavy hammer from his toolbox. He didn't want to see. He wanted to destroy. He swung at the drywall, the impact echoing like a gunshot through the Victorian frame. The plaster crumbled, revealing the exposed internal anatomy of the house. But instead of the expected mess of insulation and wiring, he found a surgical precision that defied physics. Behind the wall sat a structure of balsa wood and lath, a two-story miniature replica of their own home, nested within the master bedroom skeleton like a tumor. The detail was obsessive. The tiny windows had real glass. The miniature floorboards were stained the exact shade of oak as the room he stood in. He tore away a larger section of the wall, and the metamorphosis of the house became undeniable. The miniature house was wired. Thin copper filaments, no thicker than a human hair, were grafted into the home's main electrical lines. Tiny translucent tubes were tapped into the plumbing, drawing droplets of water to fill a miniature sink. It was a biological archive of their life, shrunk down and hidden in the dark. Inside the miniature parlor, a tiny fireplace flickered with a real, microscopic flame, a sensation of heat that should have been impossible. The smell of the fire that killed Lily wafted from the hole, but it was contained, localized. Elias reached a hand toward the structure, his fingers feeling immense and clumsy, a realistic monster invading a delicate world. As his shadow fell over the miniature house, the tiny doors began to slam shut, click, click, click. The sound of a dozen tiny locks turning in unison. Sarah stood behind him now, her blue eyes reflecting the orange glow of the miniature fire. She wasn't a child anymore. She was a guardian. "You're making it drafty, Daddy," she said, her voice a flat analog drone. "Lily doesn't like the cold. She says the large air tastes like dust." She held a small silver thimble filled with a dark, viscous liquid, a sensation of copper and salt. It was blood, her own or perhaps Clara's. Elias looked at the exposed miniature house and saw a new room he hadn't noticed before. The Master bedroom. In the miniature version of the room he was currently standing in, there was a tiny figure. It was a perfect likeness of Elias carved from soap or wax, standing with a miniature hammer raised against a miniature wall. The figure's face was twisted in a permanent mask of frantic, sweating concentration. The metamorphosis was recursive. The house was watching him through its own scale model. A sudden, sharp thump came from the floorboards beneath his feet. Not the house settling, but a rhythmic, wet vibration. He looked down and saw a tiny, jagged crack appearing in the oak. From the darkness beneath the floor, a small, pale-eyed human, but no larger than a bead, peered up at him through the gap. It wasn't the doll. It was something living, something that had been harvested and shrunk by the fire's transformation. The eyes moved, tracking him with a sensation of predatory intelligence. Then a voice, so high-pitched it was almost ultrasonic, vibrated through his very teeth. It didn't come from the wall, but from the miniature house's tiny vents. Move the hammer. Daddy, you're blocking the light from my garden. As he stared, the miniature figure of himself in the wall began to move. It swung its tiny hammer, and as it did, Elias felt a seismic impact against his own ribs. He coughed, and a spray of blood hit the white drywall. In the miniature house, a tiny Sarah appeared with a microscopic mop, beginning to clean the new paint from the floor. Elias backed away, but the floor felt soft, almost spongy. He looked at the door to the hallway, but it looked different, smaller, the proportions slightly off. The ceiling seemed to be descending, the claustrophobia shifting from his mind to the literal geometry of the room. The house wasn't just hiding a twin, it was folding the family into the blueprint. The sensation of the ceiling descending was not a trick of the light. It was a rhythmic, mechanical metamorphosis of the room's volume. Elias watched as the crown molding crept lower, the heavy Victorian cornices closing in like the lid of a jeweler's box. Realistic boundaries of his world were being dictated by the miniature house within the wall. He realized with a jolt of viral horror that the relationship between the two structures had inverted. The master bedroom was no longer the host. It was the shadow cast by the miniature, and as the model shifted, the reality followed. Elias tried to reach for Clara, but she remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the miniature parlor. She looked exposed, her skin taking on the matte porcelain texture of the doll in the wall. She was becoming a manifestation of the scale. When she moved her arm, it was with the stiff, articulated sensation of a ball-jointed limb. The trauma of Lily's death had acted as a solvent, dissolving the family's physical integrity until they were fluid enough to be poured into the house's new, claustrophobic mold. Sarah knelt by the exposed lath, her silver thimble now empty. She was whispering to the floorboards, her voice a low analog hum that resonated with the vibration of the house's hidden plumbing. "The guest room is ready for the move, Lily," she murmured. Elias looked at the floor where the bead-like eye had peered up at him. Crack in the oak had widened, revealing a subfloor network of tiny, hand-carved tunnels lined with the same floral wallpaper as the bedroom. The house was unskinning itself, revealing a second, secret nervous system made of copper wire and human hair, driven by a primal revenge against his own shrinking reality. Elias tried to run for the door, but his boots felt heavy, the sole sinking into the oak which now felt like warm, living skin. Every step was a sensation of treading on a tongue. He reached the door frame, but his hands were too large. The brass handle had shrunk to the size of a pill. He was being grown out of his own home. He was a macro anomaly in a world that was rapidly recalibrating to the size of a child's grief. He turned back to the wall, the hammer still gripped in his hand. The miniature house was glowing now, the internal fires casting long, dancing shadows that played across the exposed studs. He saw the tiny wax figure of himself. It was no longer standing. It was being pressed against the miniature ceiling by a tiny, invisible force. Elias felt the corresponding pressure on his own skull. His neck creaked, his spine compressing as the room's height dropped to a mere 5 feet. The sensation was one of being folded, his skeletal structure being re-engineered to fit the 10 by 10 logic of the hidden room. "Look at the garden." Daddy Sarah pointed to a section of the floor near the wall. Elias looked. Beneath a loose floorboard, a tiny garden had been planted. It wasn't made of flowers. It was made of biological relics. Lily's baby teeth were planted in neat rows, protruding from the dark soil like jagged white sprouts. A lock of Clara's hair was woven into a tiny decorative fence, and in the center, a small, pulsing mound of translucent meat. A sensation of a beating heart was being watered by a steady drip from the exposed plumbing. The house was harvesting them to grow its own interior. The analog horror of the fire finally became exposed. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been a cremation of the old scale. Lily hadn't died, had been refined. The heat had burned away the noise of her large-scale body, leaving only the essential core that could inhabit the walls. And now, the house was demanding a full set. It didn't want memories. It wanted occupants for its shadow loom. The metamorphosis reached his vision. The edges of the room began to blur into the geometric patterns of the wallpaper. He saw the shadows of the red-haired girls on the walls begin to move. They weren't just drawings. They were reflections of the things living in the lab. They were peeling themselves off the paper, their tiny, paper-thin hands reaching out to catch the large air that was escaping through the hole. Elias had smashed Dot from the miniature house. A tiny, elegant staircase slid out, extending until it touched the bedroom floor. It was made of polished bone. The tiny door at the top opened and a figure stepped out. It wasn't the doll. It was a girl no larger than a thumb, wearing a dress made of dried rose petals. Her skin was the color of ancient dust, and her eyes were the same ice blue as Sarah's. The girl looked at Elias, her head tilting with that same jerky stop-motion sensation. She didn't speak, but the vibration in the room shifted. The claustrophobia became a physical crush. The ceiling dropped another foot, forcing Elias to his knees. "The furniture is too big, Lily," Clara whispered, her voice now a high, ultrasonic chirp. "We need to trim him down to fit the parlor." Sarah produced a pair of tiny, silver surgical shears. She looked at Elias with a realistic pity. "It only hurts when you try to stay big, Daddy. Lily says the walls are much warmer anyway." As the tiny girl on the bone stairs began to descend, the floor beneath Elias began to liquefy completely. He felt himself sinking into the subfloor, his body being drawn toward the miniature house as if by a magnetic sensation. The metamorphosis was turning his bones into lath and his blood into paint. The last thing Elias saw before his head was forced below the floor line was the miniature master bedroom. The wax figure of himself was gone. In its place was a tiny, empty space waiting for a new tenant. The transition was not a sudden snap, but a sensation of excruciating compression, as if the vacuum of the wall were drinking him through a straw. Elias felt his internal organs shifting, condensing, his very realistic weight being redistributed into a dense, compact geometry. The scream that tore from his throat was no longer a human roar. It was a high-pitched, analog whistle that rattled the tiny glass panes of the miniature house. As he was pulled through the liquefied oak, the world above became a blurry, macro nightmare of receding shadows and impossible heights. He was exposed to the subterranean reality of the lab. The space between the studs was a cathedral of trauma, illuminated by the sickly purple glow of the shadow loom filaments. Sarah and Clara were looming above the crack in the floor, their faces like vast, unmoving moons, their features smoothing over into the waxy texture of the archive. From this perspective, the dust motes in the air were the size of boulders, and the scent of burnt sugar was a cloying, atmospheric pressure that threatened to drown him. Lily, the thumb-sized architect of his metamorphosis, stood at the base of the bone stairs. Up close, her metamorphosis was even more horrific. Her skin was a patchwork of vellum and dried membrane, and her ice-blue eyes were not solid, but flickering rival departure screens for the house's collective memory. She reached out a hand, her fingers multi-jointed and cold, and touched his chest. The sensation was an electric revenge, a surge of the fire's heat that finalized the unskinning of his old self. "The parlor is waiting." "Architect," she whispered, her voice vibrating through his new bones like a bow on a cello. Elias looked down at his hands. They were small, perfectly, terrifyingly small. His skin was the color of ancient dust, and his fingernails had turned a bruised, necrotic purple. He looked toward the miniature house, which was now his realistic home, and saw the 10-by-10 parlor. The tiny wax figure had been replaced by a manifestation of himself, a living, breathing tenant carved by the house's claustrophobic intent. He was no longer a father. He was a fixture. He was led into the miniature master bedroom. The exposed wall of the model showed the large world through the hole he had smashed earlier. He could see his old toolbox, now a mountain of rusted iron on a horizon he could never reach. He saw Sarah reach down with the tiny silver shears and begin to trim the edges of the floorboard crack, sealing the maternal source from the inside. The house was closing its door. The trauma was being contained inside the walls. The sensation was one of a terrifying hive mind peace. He felt the heartbeat of the house, the pulsing mound of meat in the garden, rhythming against his back. He saw the shadows of the red-haired girls on the wallpaper step into the room. They weren't just Lily. They were the multiplied identities of the house's history. They began to fold the miniature quilts, their movements jerky and surgical. "We've been waiting for a new architect," Lily said, her face a flickering mosaic of her own family's features, to keep the shadow loom spinning, to feed the garden, to make sure the large people never find the seams. Elias sat on the tiny bed. The claustrophobia had vanished, replaced by an absolute fit. He was the perfect replacement for the man who had died in the fire of his own guilt. He looked at the exposed wiring and felt a rhythmic thrumming in his nerves. He realized the house wasn't just a building. It was a biological entity, and he was now a neuron in its wooden brain above him. In the large world, he heard the heavy, realistic footsteps of a real estate agent. He heard the muffled voices of new nutrient hosts viewing the Victorian estate. "It's a bit drafty in the master bedroom," a man's voice boomed, sounding like distant thunder. "And what's with this patch of wallpaper? It looks like it's been replaced." Elias, the tiny architect, stood up and walked to the exposed section of the miniature wall. He picked up a tiny silver-tipped pen. With a sensation of ancestral pride, he began to draw. He drew a new pattern on the wallpaper, a pattern of a man with a hammer, warning the large people to stay away. But to the people on the outside, it just looked like a faint, watery stain. Metamorphosis was complete. The revenge was silent as the new owners moved and Elias pressed his ear against the lath. From the other side, he heard the ragged breath of the world he had left behind. He smiled, his waxy lips stretching over too many teeth. The blueprint had changed. The house wasn't just hiding a twin. It was growing a city, and as the new family's young son leaned close to the wall, listening to the scratch, scratch, scratch of a tiny hand, Elias whispered through the vents, "Don't worry, little one. We've already finished the room for you."